Dada is nothing. Oh, did I contradict myself? If you have a problem with constant, continuous contradiction, you can call my manager. But she probably won't do anything about it, because I'm a Dadaist, what can I say? I'm for continuous contradiction. And my anti-manifesto. Dadaism began around 1916 and lasted through World War I and after, but really said to have ended at least by 1924. It began in the Zurich club called Cabaret Voltaire. So Cabaret Voltaire was in Switzerland, and a bunch of artists had been meeting up there. It was an artist movement. It wasn't dictated by anyone else, and it really didn't have any bounds. Dadaism was even one of the only art movements that wasn't named by a critic. Dadaism was named by the artists. There's a fun story that goes along with Dadaism, that basically the artists had a French to German dictionary and had stabbed a paper knife into it, and it happened to land on the word Dada. Dada also means hobby horse, which is an interesting name and does not mean anything, of course, and is just an empty vessel for artists to pour themselves into, as is pretty much anything, I suppose. But Dadaism sort of began in Europe around that time. Most of it was due to World War I, but everyone was sort of losing their minds because of World War I and new technological advances, and a lack of wanting to believe in science. Sounds very familiar. People were sort of having an existential crisis, and Europe was going off of the rails. It was insane, and everyone was sort of just like, this is fine, it's okay, it's all gonna be good. I mean, I guess in the end it was, but anyways, Europe was sort of going off the rails, and artists got together in the Cabaret de Voltaire in Switzerland. Switzerland was known to be sort of neutral in this argument. It wasn't really standing for or against anything. As a Dadaist says, Dadaism was inside a birdcage surrounded by lions. Essentially, Dadaism was cultivated in a community or an area that was said to be neutral. Now, we don't really know that it was necessarily neutral. I mean, Switzerland's like Canada. They're just trying to make a good reputation for themselves when really they're not perfect in any way, except for everyone loathes them for their universal health care. I don't know if Switzerland has universal health care, but so, maybe Switzerland's just trying to make a good reputation for itself, but it's not necessarily that was necessarily neutral, but for the most part, it was fairly neutral. There wasn't a lot going on, but artists were sort of scared of this idea of warfare and death and technology and science and moving forward, so they created what is known as an anti-art movement, because it wasn't necessarily supposed to be an art movement, as their anti-manifesto, because they don't like manifestos, but they wrote a manifesto. It says a lot about how the movement really just means nothing. It's really just for artists to do whatever they want and make it look weird, and the point is for rejection. I mean, as is any art movement, right? The point is just for people to reject you. Now, if you don't reject this video, then you are not a common folk, and maybe you're just too basic, but anyways, the Dadaists were constantly looking for people to reject them. So, around 1916 or 1917, Marcel Duchamp noticed that in New York there was an art gallery that was saying it would accept any and all artwork. Of course, this was the perfect challenge for a Dadaist because, they probably just believed that they could make something that would be rejected, and fair enough, he did. Marcel Duchamp submitted a urinal with the title The Fountain, which was immediately rejected and was a huge victory for Dadaists because obviously they knew they had won that. It was a good thing. It wasn't like a bad thing, or they weren't looking to make money off of it. They were looking for the rejection. They were looking to be frowned upon because that was their victim complex. I don't know. But anyways, the artists were sort of going insane, and so when they got their rejection, they started making more. And it was when they coined the ready-mades. A ready-made is essentially an object or a piece of art that was made out of like a found object, something that was manufactured or industrial, like the urinal, for instance, was being mass manufactured. And so Marcel Duchamp happened to be able to get a hold of one, and so he used that. Dadaism is very similar to Romanticism. Romanticism was a rejection of modernity, except for Dadaism was, as is contradicting, for and against modernity. But a lot of it had to do with this rejection of technology, which was the same as Romanticism. Away from industrial, because during the time of Dadaism, industrialization was a huge thing. There were factory workers, and people were starting to understand filmmaking and sort of things like that. And so there was this huge rejection of technology. And so the ready-made came from objects that were industrialized or were mass-produced, maybe found in the garbage, in the dumpster, or something that you wouldn't usually think is art. And this sort of made people question, well, what even is art? And that was sort of why it was an anti-art movement, because it was moving away from the traditional side of art and making something that was against all forms of logic. People didn't want any rational thinking. You were just supposed to think, you're just supposed to do it, right? I mean, in contemporary, the Dadaists can be compared to like memes, meme culture, because meme culture is funny, but it makes no sense. Like, it goes beyond rational thought. I mean, we see a picture of like a cat, or like a hairless cat, and it blows up and becomes famous. I mean, that's insane, right? But not really, actually. It's Dadaism. During the time of Dadaism, as I mentioned before, World War I was happening. And World War I was a really big deal. Because for an event like Dadaism, for a movement like Dadaism to begin, there needed to be that, like, catalyst for it. There needed to be something so bad to happen that it would send people spiraling. So the German government was not great. But essentially this very stupid person got into leadership and did a lot of really crazy, dumb things. And you know what happens when somebody really stupid gets into leadership and does a lot of really dumb things. So somebody got into dictatorship and did a lot of really dumb things. For instance, when they were running short of money, they decided to print more, which caused hyperinflation, and then people couldn't buy things because a loaf of bread was literally $200 billion. And this was sort of a predicament for people because while sort of like the right was supporting this dictatorship and supporting we must have social form and constructs to keep us together, and then the left was sort of like, no. Very similar to modern times. But so a lot of the Dadaists were sort of like leftists, Democrats, communists. There's a whole range of them. You know, again, there was a lack of communication on the part, so anyone could be a part of it. because of this government dictatorship and the stupid decisions of this terrible leader and World War I happening, people were getting very upset very easily. And people were wondering, what even is the point of existing if we're just going to die? And what is even the point of social constructs? We don't even have to have form. We don't have to have structure. We don't have to have any of that stuff. Everything is too boring. We could make it so much more interesting. What if artists just ruled the world, right? And so, because of all of this, the Dadaists got together in that club, and they came up with Dadaism. A lot of Dadaist artists got really political. Because of this inflation and because of this terrible government, there was this big separation between the rich and the poor. Wait, there's literally no difference between contemporary and the 20th century. There's this picture, and it basically depicts a day, a regular day. The poor working class have their lunch boxes and tools in hand, and the upperclassmen, or all men, they look like terrible people. They look like the people that are the CEOs of McDonald's right now. Raoul Haussmann made a sculpture entitled Mechanical Head. So the mannequin head, made from wood, was basically against, there was this person who said something about how everything is mind. And of course the Dadaists had to contradict that, because man is stupid and the world is crumbling and there's no reason for us to exist right now. And so basically for Haussmann, man is empty-headed. There is nothing in here. We have no more capabilities than which chance has glued to the outside of our skulls. So that was a very famous artwork that was done, and there were some other artworks, especially collage is a really big thing. Collage was almost surrealist in a lot of ways. There were a big thing that I noticed in collage was people were taking different body parts from different magazines and arranging them differently to make superhuman beings. Or they were making poems, and the found poem sort of emerged like this, where you take pieces of paper and you cut them all up and you tape them back to the paper and you see what you get, and they make no sense, but in a way they do make sense. The same thing was happening with music, with Dadaism, where basically it literally sounded like a cat playing the piano. But it was also chants. It sounded a little bit like jazz, but jazz is much better. Jazz is an art form. This was just different piano playings, messing around. There's a notable figure. His name is Tristan Tzara, and he, along with Hugo Ball, sort of was one of the main people who founded the ideals and ideas of Dadaism. And so he wrote an anti-manifesto manifesto. Literally, in one of the first lines of the manifesto, he says, "This is not a manifesto, but it is a manifesto. But it's not a manifesto. You can do whatever you want, but you also have to do this. But no, you can still do whatever you want. And Dadaism means nothing. Oh, but it also means this." Another notable thing that happened in Dadaism was, as I mentioned earlier, in Germany there was this there was this government that people didn't like. There was inflation, there's poverty, and so there was this uprising against this government. in contemporary would be the conspiracy theories about the election. But people decided, wouldn't it be a wonderful idea if we commit an insurrection? Because obviously that really goes very well for people. I mean, just use your white privilege to get away with everything. That's fine, I guess. So that was an interesting similarity. So when people didn't like the government and they didn't like it, they decided not to trust democracy and just to take down government, because that always works out really well. But someone was arrested for it, and so I guess they got what they deserved. Another thing that was happening with Dadaism was film. Film was actually a big thing. Now, I know I said that they were against technology, but they weren't really against technology because they liked film. And so they weren't against film. Film was fine. And they made a lot of films. And films actually worked really well for them because the techniques that they employed in their filmmaking was really easy to accomplish using the new developing technology of filmmaking at the time. It was the perfect scenario for them. Like, everything was on the rise, everything was new, and you could play around with a lot of things. And so the Dadaists used that sort of newfound technology to their advantage at the time, instead of complaining about it and being annoyed by whatever. Now, there is a little bit of an issue, because if you've ever watched Dada film, you might know that a lot of it is silent. And the reason that it's silent is because around 1930, Hitler began to commit mass atrocities, and he was very against the Dadaists. And the Dadaists were protesting him because he was an awful human being, and what do you do when somebody's an awful human being? You protest against them. And so the Dadaists were protesting against him, and so basically during that time, Hitler wanted modern art destroyed. So as when any dictator wants anything destroyed, what do? Burn the books. Mock the people. So there was a lot of burning and mocking happening, and in the long run, they removed the sound from Dadaism, from Dadaist film. So that means that a lot of them are silent. The other tricky thing about Dadaism is that it's very hard to find and collect the works of art, mostly because Dadaism is subjective, and you can't really know if something qualifies, because going back to what I was saying before about the anti-manifesto manifesto, it's essentially Dadaism is based off of the recognition and acceptance of the meaninglessness of life. And essentially, the Dadaists, instead of creating a movement to comfort everyone and help them through World War I, decided, let's just cause more chaos. Because chaos is fun, and lighting fires is a good time, and burning things is great. Let's not make something to comfort people. No, there's no purpose. There's no reason to life. Morality doesn't even exist. So what is even the point? Let's just make a movement that makes no sense and try to make people think that they can figure out what they mean when they really can't. Essentially, Dada was to tear people's systems down and illusions. And contemporarily, we can see this as people are trying to tear, I wouldn't use tear because personally I'm in favor, but to take down the ideas of social constructs. For instance, I think of clothing. Clothing and gender is a social construct. And clothing is highly gendered, like the pockets issue. Like, why in the world are men's pockets bigger than women's pockets? That's insane. That's ridiculous. And everyone knows that purses are highly uncomfortable and terrible. But people are sort of trying to tear down that system because clothing shouldn't be based on gender. It should be based on body type. Clothing based on gender makes no sense at all. It just doesn't make sense. For Zara, Dada empathetically does not want to participate in the comforts of social movements. So he is writing an anti-manifesto manifesto. This is a quote from Zara. "Write a manifesto, and I want nothing. Yet I say certain things, and in principle I am against manifestos. I am also against principles." This man makes no sense, but yet he does make a lot of sense. He is someone against manifestos and someone against principles. And I, for one, am against manifestos and against and for principles. We are one and the same. Zara is contradicting himself, but it's fine, even though it's illogical and makes no sense. The point of Dadaism is to do that. So even though he contradicts himself, that's fine, because he does later in his manifesto acknowledge that he contradicts himself, and therefore making that a huge part of Dadaism. Another quote from Zara's manifesto, which I had a lovely time reading. It was so great. I was constantly amazed by all of the words that it had to say. It emulated the idea of a cat playing the piano. That's what it felt like reading it. It was just utter amusement. But to the quote. "There is no ultimate truth. Does anyone think that by a minute of refinement or logic, they have demonstrated the truth and established the correctness of their opinions? I greasy objectify and harmony, the science that finds everything in order. I am against systems. The most acceptable system is on principle to have none." Now, Zara, what are we going to do without the systems? Have you thought about that? No, you haven't. Perhaps the closest that Zara comes to making possibly maybe a graspable statement of the Dada Creed is, quote, "I write this manifesto to show that people can perform contrary actions together while taking one fresh gulp of air. I am against action, for continuous contradiction, for affirmation too. I am neither for nor against, and I do not explain because I hate common sense." So while this makes no sense, it actually does make sense, because it's the principle behind Dadaism. It's not supposed to make sense, and they're constantly supposed to be contradicting themselves. It's the whole point. The point is to say that we're not going to be political and then be political about it. Even though this is illogical, in the same way, it is logical. A lot of the ideas of Dadaism is just to mock humanity, because humanity is stupid and humans are terrible people, and we don't even deserve to exist on this planet. And of course, I am just mocking humanity right now, which makes no sense because I'm human. But that is just continuous contradiction. A lot of the art just had to do with trying to get people to reject them, trying to get people to question them, and not understand exactly what was happening. This idea was to break things, violate conventions, mock the ways that humanity tries to make sense. Oftentimes, Dadaism also mocks religion, culture, fashion, nationalism, war, art, consumerism, technology, science, family, love, etc. And a lot of it makes sense because to them, technology was scary. This was the first time that they were seeing guns that could, really take a number on somebody. And 8 billion people died. Or 8 million people died. This was not a small thing. This was World War I. This was trench warfare. There were tanks, there were trenches, there were guns, there were bombs. It was insane, and people were dying, and there was poverty. This is a huge, massive deal. And so it makes sense how people would just get to a point where, why am I even still trying to make a purpose in life and trying to exist when there just isn't any more a reason? And the same thing is, so there are a lot of photographs from the war suggesting the destructiveness and also the dehumanizing effect of these new military technologies. The communist-influenced Dadaists saw the root of this destruction not just in the factory owners and financiers who profited from the weapons and manufacturing. Of something that's visible in the Dada Fair photograph, which is a famous photograph depicting some Dada art, Dadaists, and other things, was two works that refer to another lingering effect of the war. And something that influenced a lot of Dadaists was the common sight of soldiers who had returned from war with very bad injuries. People would be missing limbs, they would have maybe possibly prosthetics, things that would have been a little bit offsetting to see after war. People seized this opportunity. Places were in need of Dadaism. Germany was weak, Switzerland was weak, the United States was weak, Paris was weak. People were in a massive weak spot, and Dadaism sought to use that to its advantage. It saw weakness and was going to use it to make a coherent movement out of it. And that was incredibly smart. This movement later influenced styles like avant-garde and surrealism. Surrealism is upcoming next. Surrealism was the two are very alike. Dadaism actually has some very surrealist images. And another notable one is Andy Warhol's pop art. So the Manifesto, even though it makes no sense, the reason it's smart and such a good tactic is because the goal was to prevent rational thought. It wasn't supposed to make sense. It was supposed to make people be like, okay, what the heck, man? You are weird. You make no sense. Scattered throughout the Manifesto, there are statements that suggest that he has a belief in radical individualism. Like I was saying before, a lot of this just has to do with radical individualism and artists finding themselves and going through their existential crises, trying to just stay alive at this point. What happened, though, with this radical individualism was they sacrificed the communicative part of art, which is often crucial in making art, is that part is very important. So while they did a really good job of being individualistic, being provocative, being offensive, trying to make a difference, they didn't do a very good job in communicating. But there were some requirements that sort of helped Dadaism be discerned. As Sarah says, what we need is works that are strong, straight, precise, and forever beyond understanding. Dada, as I said, is nothing. Dada is nonsense, but it's carefully produced nonsense. It's targeted at a very specific effects, to mirror the senselessness of the universe. What's very interesting is that we're about 100 years, 2020 would have been 100 years from Dadaism. It's been about a century since Dadaism. This impact was mainly in places like New York, Paris, Berlin, Cologne, Hanover, and because of this individualism, this lack of communication, Dadaism in different cities was represented individually, had different meanings in different places. But in 1924, it was just over. It was done. It was very quick. It was like, now we're going to start, now we're going to end, and move on. For a lot of people like Marcel Duchamp, he had several phases of art. He started off by painting impressionistic art, then he sort of moved into more of a cubist style and then a futurist style, and those styles sort of morphed into a Dadaist style. And then he moved on, like all artists do, changing with the times and moving forward. Dadaism refused limits on its expression. Its proponents experimented in painting while also contradicting themselves and declaring painting dead. Because most of the Dadaist art you see is collage. But there was painting. But there wasn't painting. It had a lot of connections to cancel culture, to sculpture, to photography, movies, and literature. Photography was actually a big thing because they were able to manipulate photos in very interesting ways. Dadaism was also really weird in fashion. Dadaists might wear like cardboard, and there was this big connection between different medias. Something could be written and also performed. Not like a script though, like something could be physically written in a book and then it would be translated to be performed in a movie or something like that. Just how we see remakes of books, except for this was probably much better because most of books being turned into movies suck and are terrible. What is most striking is the simultaneous need for Dada. Things were crumbling. Germany and Europe and Paris and New York were becoming fragile, and people saw an opportunity. When government systems get fragile, people, artists, humanity sees an opportunity to create something, for the better or for the worst. When the countries were weak because of war, artists decided to have their existential crises and create a movement based off of radical individualism and constant contradiction. And yet, in this sense, it worked. What's interesting to note is the movements that came before Dada. Because a lot of what happens in a movement or in a weak spot has to do with anything that happened before the movement began. Before Dadaism, there was Expressionism. And Expressionism had a lot to do with emotions and sort of conveying the psyche and understanding the world around us through feeling. There's also Futurism, which represented movement and speed, and it sort of combined with Cubism in a way to create that movement of feeling. And so people were heading in the direction of Dada, they just needed an extra push, and World War I did that for them. There's this theory that there's going to be a resurgence of Dada, and I already think that there has been with meme culture, but what is the breaking point for America? Well, we do remember a very fun year called 2020. I'm sorry if I'm taking this too lightly because a lot of people died. There was tragedy, and 2021 is a year that if we could just forget it, I think we would. Murder hornets, COVID. Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and now we have Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, which makes us very happy because she's making some wonderful decisions right now. And we had great weather all the time, wonderful weather that we got to deal with, and basically the worst mental health year of our entire lives. It's interesting because a year like 2020 happens during a social media era, during a social media era. And the same thing is with Dada. Dada happened during a newspaper era. Newspaper was becoming super popular. Propaganda was being spread. And so it's interesting that our resurgence will probably happen during the time of social media because people are invested in social media, not in just the popular things, but in everyone. People can find out all your information. It's probably not good. I mean, Google probably knows more about me than I do. But it allows for sort of a resurgence of this Dada movement. And personally, I think that it's already happened with meme culture. Meme culture is vague. Meme culture makes no sense. Meme culture defies all notions of rational thinking. And yet, in the same way, it makes sense. But there is a theory. So the theory is that, yes, Dadaism is emulated in meme culture, but there will also be a resurgence of it in general, in total. And some other connections to contemporary, like, as I mentioned, Dadaism was emulated in a lot of Andy Warhol's work. And more contemporarily, David Bowie did a lot of, has sort of his music style incorporates that. There's this fashion style, like Moschino fashion style, that is very unpractical and very Dadaist. Meme culture has just gotten ahead of me. I also made this. It is a poem made out of a bunch of random words. Lethal poem fires I even be stream. Subjectively poem foam soup that are feather. Light the national never saying. Consciousness shoulder neutrality summer. Spring what tears down found. Have wow writing bird cage. It's quite Dadaist, I believe. All in all, Dadaism is not meant to make sense. It's not meant to be anything, and yet it was. And Dadaism is nothing, and it is something. Do you like Dadaism? No. You did not just leave. She doesn't like Dadaism. I'm sorry. This video was pointless. Existence is stupid. Now I'll go home and have an existential crisis. All jokes aside, please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be posting once every 3 weeks, and I will be exploring more topics in the future. I explored Cubism. This one is about Dadaism. I will be exploring Surrealism, Futurism, probably maybe jealousy in art, and more. So stay tuned.